Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, William Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, why do feminists want to work for capitalists if Marxism is true? Tim, why did you come up with this idea? What interests you about feminism, capitalism, and Marxism?
What interests me about this is the observation that you have a lot of women working, and this includes upper class women, not just lower class or working class women, working for firms which are capitalist large employers. If you look at the old Marxist analysis, you generally view that capitalists are bad exploiters. So the question is, why would you want to work for them? You have these sort of girl power type feminists here that that being career centric here. This seems very contrary. If in fact that Marxists are these sort of evil, if in the fact that capitalist employers are these sort of evil exploiters here. Now, of course, the women could become capitalists themselves. We have phenomena. For example, there was the CEO of Lockheed Martin for about 7 years or so was a woman. So we have had this phenomenon of them becoming capitalists or being employed by capitalists, as compared to the traditional model, which isn't necessarily the traditional model of being housewives. This is the 1950s model here. Now, again, that's more of the upper middle class, because you have to remember, in the 1920s, 1910s, you had the mills and other things, girls and women worked here. But then again, the Marxists in general, this is one of the weird flip sides of a lot of feminists who think that women never worked here. They have a sort of strange view here. They would work in these sort of mills, weaving factories, and so forth, and they were quite terrible conditions. So the first, I'm going to get to the analysis here. The first statement one could do for the long question is, Marxism is false, and just move along here. We're both pure capitalists of the sort of Hoppian, Rothbardian, Friedman tradition. We basically think that is somewhat correct here. But interestingly, again, the Hoppians, which were sort of that have more of an affinity in sort of dark behind the moon ways. So just saying it's false and moving along is the Deidre, formerly Deidre McCloskey maneuver here. She had a debate at the Oxford Forum with a feminist. She, in that debate, to me, sounds much worse than her opponent. Her opponent was more clear. Her opponent said, in order to abolish the patriarchy, we have to abolish capitalism. So that option here that McCloskey did is Marxism is false. The Marxist theory of exploitation based on factor prices, unjust property acquisition of resources held in common, and wage slavery. And again, McCloskey is a critic in that talk of wage slavery. She said it's the most annoying, one of the more annoying features of the Marxists, is all basically false. Now, we did an episode on wage slavery, which again is, you posted that somewhere, and you got some proback from sort of classical liberal capitalists and classical liberal conservatives who don't like that idea. But again, to go back to the affinity point, the pure capitalists are willing to admit that for a variety of reasons that, it's harder to open businesses. There's certain subsidies that are given to mega corporations, and there's certain the statists things that undermine other institutions here that might exist in stronger form if the state went away. So I think this needs to be made because in the very Oxford debate, she was critical, as was said. She cites a good Marx Brothers, Groucho Marx story of a poor Marxist who's starving, who asks his capitalist friend for a job, and he says, I don't want to exploit you. I don't want to hire you. That's actually a very good joke that Groucho Marx makes. It was probably the highlight of her speech here. The trouble with feminism is that much of it seems to be or is Marxist of some kind or in practice. This is self-admitted to by many. If you drew a Venn diagram, many of them would have the feminists who identify with some version of the left. If I went to Jacobin magazine or the Jimmy Dore show or any of these left-wing publications who identify as left-wing, someone on our forum on our Why to Abolish the State asked, how do we identify the left? One of the easy ways to do it is just self-identification. This is sort of a Wittgensteinian way. If you identify as left, most of the people who identify as left are feminists. There might be anti-feminist left-wingers, but the amount are very small. So it's sort of like defining the contents of a very small box here. So In that way, her opponent is much more clear, at least in theory here. And McCloskey was defending firms, but it was, to me, very convoluted here. I encourage people to watch it here. I don't really want to re-explain her argument here because I think it's somewhat convoluted in theory. Whether in practice it's actually true is of some question. I think we're going to get to that. I do think a clear position is the sort of traditional Catholic and the sort of traditional Protestant position before like 1980 for Protestants, who criticized capitalism as being greedy, exploitative, and too individualistic. This is like a G.K. Chesterton position almost. But those types don't tell women to go work in factories. They're not girl power feminists, or go become the CEO of Lockheed or so forth. They're not in that mold here. So that to me is a consistent position. But the first position to me is inconsistent here. Capitalism is exploitive. So what should girls do? Girls should go out and work instead of raising their children. Peter Hitchens had a column here. There's some British MP woman, of course, who had brought her infant to there. And Peter Hitchens was like, why? Is this really a good place for a child here? Now, I mean, he didn't really care per se, but he's just like, isn't there a better thing for you to do with your time here? Now, if you want to say women need to work outside the home or become capitalists because they'd starve to death, that is reasonable. But I doubt that women MP who did it, or some of these upper middle class women or upper class women, that's their they're not going to starve to death. I highly doubt that woman who's the MP would have starved to death if she didn't take that job as a member of parliament or the Lockheed Martin CEO. Now she and so forth. There's other ones you could do. So this is where the want comes in. Now, interestingly, the middle class, the lower class, they'll work for like waiters or servers or like Amazon pickers. And this is sort of the underbelly, interestingly enough. And Tyler Cowen, in one of his Hayek lectures, points out that modern women between like 20 and 35 work more outside of the home than they ever did in history, and they sort of work more than men in that category here. If you parse the data here, they work more hours than men. So this is under like a sort of men sit around and play video games critique, which actually I think is sort of a good existential move. It's sort of the MGTOW move here. But women between like 10, 20 and 35 work on average, I think, more hours. And actually, there's a Catholic podcast here that I occasionally listen to, and they were pointing out that, like, hey, look, if you take the stereotypes seriously, a lot of these service jobs are actually better for women. If you just sort of take the stereotypes seriously. And then if you combine the fact that with all the sort of hiring initiatives that occur, it becomes like a slam dunk here. And that's something that Scott Adams was saying why he left his job. He was in IT or something, and he's like, hey, they don't want, they're basically only hiring them anyway. So, like, again, to point to contrary to the paleos, why there wasn't a golden age, like both my grandmothers worked, but one of them worked in a factory sewing and the other worked as a secretary. But these are sort of like, for them, it was more like they had to work in a sense. Now, again, there's always sort of the Amish men like critique. They say you can just live off less. And I do agree with that. But that's not really the condition for most of the sort of what I'll call girl power feminism that we see today, the careerist, Gloria Steinem type maneuver here. So why is this happen here? Now, again, it could be an aversion to having children. That's obvious. But many of these people do eventually get children at some point, or they don't have children, of course. So why is that? What made careers? And again, in the sort of de facto society, we have this sort of corporate capitalist society. Again, it's not pure Rothbardian Hoppian capitalism, of course. And many of these feminists come out of the Marxist left or overlap with them. But what's the initiative? What explains this? Swithin, any thoughts on my analysis or statements here?
It's certainly true that feminism really comes out of Marxism to a large extent. It's just an application of the class struggle between the capitalist and the proletariat, between men and women primarily. So you are correct that it is essentially Marxist. Well, not all feminists are Marxists, but certainly it would be undeniable that feminism has Marxist heritage. That's certainly true. So they then say, we need to get rid of the patriarchy. And then women can be free. But as you point out, the existence in the current sort of economic order, which I think I've come around to saying something like state capitalism is probably the best description of it, provides lots of sort of empowerment, inverted commas, for women to be empowered with corporations, etc. Which and if you identify that with sort of, as the Marxists typically do, they call capitalism is the existing economic order. Well, this has actually provided significant amounts of advancement for careerist women. Also, I mean, the big change that allows sort of careerism in women is contraception. And who developed contraception? Well, it was the capitalists. It was the Western, it was the USA, it was Britain in the 19th century and the early 20th. Those are the ones who created it, and that's kind of created the conditions in which feminism can rise up. Now, the question arises, is this the internal contradiction of capitalism, in that it is liberating women so that they can then tear down the whole structure? I suppose you could take that kind of line. But it seems to be the case that it's only in industrial societies that heavily industrialized societies in which feminism can actually work in a way. Well, that's seemingly for two reasons. One is a sort of contraceptive thing, which is one more reason. But also, I mean, if you have a situation where most of the work needs to be done by hand and there's relatively few powered tools, well, then it's kind of going to be obvious for manual work, men are just going to be better on average. I mean, it's clearly obvious. I mean, obviously there are some women who are stronger than some men, but on average, I mean, they're not going to do anything. And also there's very few sort of hierarchies that they can sort of climb in that way. Now, there are hierarchies to climb, but they're unlikely to climb them. And also, the size of firm, etc., in the sort of pre-industrial period is lower. So I suppose then the Marxists might claim, well, what we need is industrialization with Marxism and economic progress, which is possible in principle. They don't seem to be very good at doing it. Most of the sort of forced industrialization programs based on like Stalinist Russia or Maoist China didn't really seem to go particularly well. So it seems to be only in sort of like these, the state capitalist societies in which have industrialized pretty well. And those countries have now sort of industrialized insofar as they have been able to reduce regulations and adopt more of a, let's say, state capitalist model rather than a direct top-down managerial central planning, a less sort of directly centrally planned society. Now, of course, the Marxists could always claim, well, yeah, this is kind of okay. It's better than it was before in like the pre-industrial period. But what we really need to do is to tear it down to bring in utopia, because this is kind of an opium for women, this sort of corporate culture in which they can ascend hierarchies and get social status by following the rules in the organization and climbing up. We really need to sort of tear it down so they can be truly liberated. I mean, you could make that kind of claim from the Marxist position. But it's certainly true that those countries which are more, quote unquote, more free market and less sort of centrally planned are the ones that provided the most options for women to invest in the workplace. Now, you can then get sort of like the individualist feminists who would kind of broadly agree with that kind of stuff. So the best example of that is probably, I think she's called Wendy McElroy, who makes those sorts of arguments as though industrialization sort of liberated women. But that kind of individualist streak in feminism is relatively small. You are right to point out that women have always worked, but the question is one of orientation. A lot of time when women worked, and they did, and they've always done historically, it's what was their main sort of orientation. So you say your grandparent mothers worked, but their primary role, they would have perceived it as, would probably be focused around the home. They would work to get money to help run the household, but the primary focus was the household. It wasn't external to it, and it was kind of a supplemental role. And I think that's the big difference that feminism, as we get sort of the post-Second World War, brings in, is not just women working outside the home, but that the orientation of women is away from children and sort of the home and more focused on the external world, and therefore in that sense is more similar to the traditional sort of male view. That said, it hasn't entirely succeeded, because if you look at degrees that men and women do, the degrees that women do are pretty much people orientated, which correlates with sort of what you might think is traditional female orientations, whereas men do things involving stuff in the external world and STEM fields and things, which at least to some extent explains wage differentials. So those would be my overall introductory thoughts on the relationship between sort of capitalism, Marxism, and feminism.
One quick aside, which a further irony is they oftentimes view, you said about men's work, women's work. There is a strange irony where women want to pursue a certain class of them, want to pursue the most manliest jobs here. So this just shows up in like military service too. They want to become like, I don't know, fighter pilots or like the CEO of Lockheed. I just think that's a hilarious story here that exists here. And again, the CIA recently came out with a very hilarious set of ads here, which basically said the CIA was a defender of feminism here. I think the current, I don't know if anyone's following the Senate thing on this, but I think the current director of the CIA, we're talking about January 6th, is a woman as well. So we get the phenomena that, it sounds convoluted to say that, that they'll say that, being a soldier or whatever is being a CEO is sort of like, just about pursuing glory and individualism and hurting others. And then what do women turn around? Let's go do that. Now, again, it could be that being a soldier or being a CEO is actually a good thing, and we should do it. But if you go back to like, I don't know, Charles Dickens or anybody in like these sort of some of these critical, interestingly, the sort of right-wing anti-capitalists are sort of interesting here if you look at them. And then you look at what modern feminists do. There's a really interesting, some really interesting disparallels and parallels there that I must find odd. But I do think the sort of right-wing capitalist position, which is pro-family, makes more sense than this. Now, again, the origins are different though, and that's where things get tricky here. Because, like for example, Ayn Rand. There's interesting, I think FEE put a symposium on with Ayn Rand. Now, the FEE is more of like a classical liberal, which makes sense here. I mean, Rand, of course, is a sort of militant anarchist objectivist here. She's not in the anarchist camp here. But one of the things we point out that most Ayn Rand fans are, she's like one of the more successful female writers here. Yet she herself is quite chauvinistic, shall we say. And her characters, again, are quite chauvinistic. So someone asked, why are most of her fans male? It is an interesting thing that some of the more successful things. And again, you have to point out, there's a lot of problems with her. But Margaret Thatcher, again, she's a woman in politics here. But she sort of ran she sort of did it in the of some kind of right. Now, again, you can always come up with geeks, and probably many of them, you probably know them better than I do. But it is interesting. You do get certain women in there. But it's always, to me, it's always sort of dodgy, considering what the left thinks of the military in general. Now, maybe they like the Red Army because it defeated fascism. But they're not. I doubt they're very big defenders of invading Argentina or the Falklands, or big defenders of what Lockheed does. What do you make of those comments here, Swithin? Would you agree with the sort of right-wing capitalist position? Now, we can disagree over the technical points of like profits and things like that, but like in a theoretical way, don't you think that makes more sense? What do you make of that, Swithin?
Well, I do think that there are some women who do have who are very ambitious, and I think there are some. There's not very many of them. I mean, interesting with the CEO stuff, by far the best paid CEO in England is female. She is the CEO of Bet365. Again, interestingly, an organization you probably well, if you look at betting, it's typically men who bet.
And interestingly, betting, if you take the 1920s feminists, that's probably a list of things they banned because they view it as a sort of like just their husbands would waste all their money on gambling. So that's another further irony there.
Oh yeah. So, I mean, certainly amongst the sort of upper middle class feminists, which is what the original ones were really, to a large extent. And she gets paid per year almost the entirety of all the other CEOs of all the FTSE 100 companies. That is the top 100 firms on the stock exchange as measured by market capitalization, which is the current share price times the number of shares. She earns almost what all they earn combined. So last year, she paid herself £421 million per year in a year. And the previous year, she paid like 300 and something million. She is seriously unpoor, to put it mildly. And so you do get this. And you are right, the irony about, oh no, we don't like military, that's toxic masculinity is all about the military. Oh no, but we'll applaud lots of women in the military as well. I mean, this reminds me, the film critic Mark Kermode always pointed out this was a ridiculous thing, although he's not, doesn't object to this per se. There's a film from 1996 called Courage Under Fire, where Meg Ryan is a military helicopter pilot, which he just said was ridiculous and made zero sense. Now, he has no objection to sort of women in the military per se. He's a leftist. But that did bring that to mind. But yeah, the irony is we don't like war is bad, but then, oh, well, we'll have women in the military, which is kind of, why are you doing that? Although, as Keith Preston has pointed out, it seems to be the military these days is sort of, to a large extent, turning itself into more like a militarized wing of the public schools, whereas all the proper fighting is sort of like outsourced to sort of specialist military contractors. So there could be that kind of change. But the thing is,
I also quick question. I also want to add a further aside. A lot of them a lot of the military at this point is support role. It's not combat. Like, I mean, you know, if you look at like the workings of a ship or workings of like U.S. like. I think to support one troop in Iraq, it requires like, you know, you have to have like a cargo plane flying back and forth. You need to have ships going in there. There's a huge amount of support roles that go into it. So like as far as combat is concerned, it is only a very small front. And your point about the special forces being like, you know, this is the flip side. Then you have the special forces, which are heavy like Jocko types, which are much more males. Now they did change. This was pointed out by Todd Lewis, and I now read into this. This isn't true. They did change some of the standards. But to be fair, a lot of things like being a sniper, for example, it's not entirely clear you need to be a big macho man to be a sniper. So this goes back to the industrialization point. You know, helicopter pilots, those things, you know, they can be in theory done by women. There's no, in this regard, technology, including like, has liberated it, not necessarily the system necessarily here. So it is true that the military is somewhat of a make work program, but in a certain way, that's always been the case. But it is strange that they want to work there. But you keep going on your point there. I just wanted to add that.
No, you're entirely right with the bureaucratic infrastructure and stuff. So the question is, if you're a soldier, you know, are you actually a soldier? Because some of them could well be medics, which again, is a traditional sort of female role. But they have some sort of combat training, but they're not really on the front line. So it is difficult to sort of like make the distinction as to what they're actually doing. But I think, again, in line with their Marxist heritage, the feminist movement is very much defined about what it's against more than what it is for. So because it's basically to a large extent a negative ideology, anything which is subversive, inverted commas, or what's another good term? It's so I can't think of another good term at the moment. It must be supported because it's a way of sort of undermining the current status quo. And so they're always like they perceive those things as sort of transgressive acts. And this is a way of bringing down the system and changing it. And this is how you get like Hollywood producing these sort of feminist and sort of anti-racialist tracks. And no, how subversive it is. It's like, Nah, it might be subversive like 60 years ago, but since you basically control the Hollywood and the media since like the 1950s almost, frankly, that's uninteresting in the extreme. But they still have this sort of mentality. It's the same type of thing that of person who still seems to think that we're somehow run by right-wing Christian fundamentalists. They're always lurking. They're sort of behind the surface, running everything.
Or they think the literal Ku Klux Klan or like Cecil Rhodes is in charge.
Yeah. Everyone's wearing white hoods, and in the background you can't see him. Just got the white hoods everywhere, and it's like, what? This is just doesn't bear any resemblance to reality in any way, shape, or form. So yeah, I think again with the military, and also, oh, this is hilarious. I remember seeing an advert for some drama series about the fire brigade, and there's like this female fireman, and I'm like, you just simply cannot be one. You got to like pull people out of burning buildings. You're like 8 stone. You're tiny. Like, this simply makes no sense. But it's like, oh no, we put it in, and it's all kind of real. It's realistic. It's gritty. It's like, no, it's not. It's ridiculous. Never happened. But the whole point, I think, as well, though, is related to the military, is a way of sort of undermining sort of traditional femininity and masculinity. It's all sort of like on a scale, and anyone can be whatever they want. Although, as we said before, masculinity is kind of bad, except when women do it, when it's okay, and increasingly when men do it in drag, at which point it's fine. But if they're not in drag, then it's not. But again, it's the whole leftist mentality. It's just defined about what it's against, and so it's just a collection of pot shots, which you, to current existing order, which if you try to sort of synthesize would make zero sense. I think that's what we're faced with here, really.
To further add, this is probably, now we're sort of getting to the central issue here, and this is your point about being negative ideology. I think is entirely true here. So, what would and we've done a number of episodes, like what would the ideals punishment look like, or what would the ideal police look like, if any, if there would be any need for it. And this sort of is the thing that they don't go after here. Like, should Marxists be pro-family here? Now, that sounds like a sort of strange question. Now, again, this is where the sort of right-wing anti-capitalists, sort of the Catholic Protestant ones that are anti-capitalist, they're somewhat interesting to read here, because they're sort of hyper pro-family. They have these sort of communes here. But if you look at like the actual existing communes, like the Hutterites, they're very much segregated by the sexes here. And I think from my understanding, I was reading something into this before this episode. Yaron Brooks was talking about this, which again, it's interesting here. Yaron Brooks I'm not sure if he ever said he was a feminist, but he definitely wouldn't classify as an anti-feminist. But they were looking at some of the early, like Israel's, again, you can be critical of Israel, but some of the early set up communes there, they'd be gender segregated here. So you might have the men doing some, I don't know, they were building like buildings or something like that, and the women be, in the support roles. This is what Hutterite division of labor is here. So if you look at sort of an ideal society here, it's quite interesting here that, if you sort of try to answer that question, rather than just defining what you're against here. One popular film that I think is a very sneakily subversive in the way that which if you point it out, people will get annoyed. This is one reason sometimes I like to do it, is the final Hunger Games movie. Again, some people on the right laugh when I make this analysis, but Katniss Everdeen gives up the revolution and basically goes back to a farm and raises her child. This is a very strange message here for a modern film. This is not like, sometimes modern films surprise me here, and that's the modern film that totally surprised me, that ending on it. Because of course I didn't read the books here, but I did watch some of the movies here. I was dragged to the first one, but I thought it was actually an interesting story, at least in theory. I like the sort of concept because I think there's third worldist tendencies in there. But that's an interesting. I think that's, and your point about movies being like, oh, a women fighter pilot. These things have been so overdone. It's not even like, but. And I think the hardcore Marxists are correct, and they're correct to dislike like Margaret Thatcher. Like they don't let Margaret Thatcher's, gender, and same with Ayn Rand. They don't like Ayn Rand. David Graeber is very critical of Ayn Rand here. He was making fun of Iron Man on one of the talks I was listening to. Now, if I said, "Oh, David Graeber, you're only doing that because you're a sexist," he would probably laugh at me. And he's correct to laugh at me because that's a sort of spurious comment that has no basis here. But I do think the hardcore Marxists, at least in theory, and this is why Zizek, interestingly enough, will at times get himself into trouble here. I mean, Zizek is this sort of flamboyant guy here in that regard. And in some of the ex-communist states, they're sort of becoming somewhat mildly reactionary in a certain way. Now, again, whether they're just going to eventually catch up or catch behind to what the U.S. and Britain are and parts of Germany are is of some question. But that would be my comment there. That I think they're correct to go after them, but the sort of what society ought to be is the interesting question here, because a family, if you look at a family is a kind of non-moneyed gift economy, if you want to really think about it, and it's somewhat, it's not strictly anti-egality. Well, it's depending on the structure of here, and that's actually interesting about modernity here is like you get sort of these the Quaker marriage ideals with the helpmeet George Fox and his wife. This is if anyone, this is Moldbug basically agrees. My analysis plus Moldbug's, I basically agree the Quakers invented modern marriage here. It sort of went around the world here, but through that you've helpmeet partnerships. That in theory is reasonable, but if you combine this with this girl power of feminists, then things get kind of insane here, because what you have is two functionally males here, and no one's there to raise the children here. So you just basically, your goal is just to make a lot of money, and you just sort of outsource your children raising, if you even have any. But again, making money in the capitalists for Marxists is sort of like being the good burglar. It's not really necessarily a good thing. Now, maybe being a good something or another is a good thing, like a good piano player. So in that regard, I think I might be being unfair to them. But it is the case that the family remains to be a sort of non-moneyed economy, and they sort of want to do away with it and replace it with the bureaucratic state or some sort of commune. But if you look at actual existing communes, of course, they're quite reactionary in form. Now, again, you can find communes that aren't that way. And that probably is because of demographics. Demographics underlie a lot of things because people who don't have children don't really have any future here. They sort of die out after one generation here. So that always underlies a lot of this stuff. I think I've heard you make this argument somewhere else as well. But those will be my second round of comments here, Swithin. Do you have any comments to add about like the points I made about the communes being somewhat reactionary internally, or of course why the hardcore Marxists still hate Margaret Thatcher, even though that view is clear, as well, of course, the sort of right-wing anti-capitalists. Swithin?
I think the reason why the left hate Margaret Thatcher and Ayn Rand is because they're I think they perceive them as the sort of the female version of the coconut Uncle Tom. Is they are sort of gender traitors, and therefore should be denounced with great vociferousness. I think that is what the main thing is. And also, as an aside, in general, if you look at survey data, people prefer male bosses to female ones, and especially women prefer male bosses to female bosses than men care about women and male bosses. So I think in general, just a general dislike of especially women in power. I think that's just generally true. Now, why it's true, or you say it's sexism or whatever, I just think it is the case. Interesting with Rand. Rand has an interview, I think it was in the 70s. She actually opposed any woman becoming president of the United States, because president of the United States is the commander in chief, and being head of a military is just not an appropriate role for a woman. And that's what Ayn Rand said, which she got sort of laughed at by this in the 70s, but I think it was the 70s. So that is interesting with respect to Rand. With respect to the family and the gift economy, I think you're exactly right. I mean, it is an unmoneyed gift economy, which of course then should be a good thing. And of course, this is sort of like what the right-wing anti-capitalist would say. This is kind of what we want. The criticism, though, that the Marxists have, say, the family, I mean, they might go, well, traditionally, like the 19th century, had like coverture agreements, and women couldn't own property, etc., if they were married, which they did sort of get rid of. Although they always forget that, well, if the woman committed the crime, the husband would be held responsible for it. That's kind of ignored. Now, which made a bigger difference is another question, but it is at least interesting that is the case. That said, though, I mean, why focus on the fact that women can get property or not? I mean, property is well, wasn't really theft. Proudhon didn't really mean that, but it meant certain types of ill-gotten property. But why focus on this sort of moneyed aspect? Surely we should be trying to expand the family and create this gift economy. Now, I suppose you could say, well, what you need women to sort of break the family and then to go into the corporations and then ultimately then to bring down capitalism. So then we have this world sort of commune. But as you point out, I mean, communes are simply, if they do work, they're going to be sort of pretty reactionary. As Todd Lewis likes to point out, if you look at the communists, the Bolsheviks, they're really socially conservative. Well, at least after the early time when they sort of, under Leninism, they tried sort of communes that didn't work, and then sort of under Stalin, particularly became very socially conservative. I mean, that's kind of what you're going to get. I mean, you're going to need to sort of, for it to be stable, that's kind of going to be required, because you basically just don't want feral children, because they'll turn up to feral adults, and then society has problems. But I do think it should be interesting, to turn around to a Marxist feminist to go, are you for gift economies? And it's like, oh yes, I'm really supportive of the gift economies and non-money. It's like, well, what about the family then? Isn't that a money gift economy? And that'd be an interesting rhetorical move. I don't know how they'd respond to it. They'd probably say, oh no, it was an arranged marriage or some sort of power dynamic thing. But it's like, yeah, but it's still a gift economy. So yeah, those would be sort of my sort of thoughts on your previous comments.
Now, my third line of questions / comments here is with respect to the current existing things. I sort of hinted this at the point with Tyler Calloway's lecture here. And I sort of want to ask you and sort of make my own comments. But why exactly does Deidre McCloskey think this way? Is Deidre McCloskey right? Now, we just argued sort of, we just discussed and really argued, we sort of agree about the theory behind how her theory in a way is convoluted in a sense here. But although if you go to Marxism, it sort of views capitalism as a sort of midwife to birth the future egalitarian society, interestingly enough. So Marx praises capitalism in a sort of backhanded way, is breaking down the rule of idiocracy. I always find that hilarious there. But if you take that seriously here, why does Deidre McCloskey think that way? Is she correct to think that way? A lot of she's a minarchist. She's a classical liberal. She's like a sort of welfare state capitalist here. But she's very supportive of it. And she made a lot of fine points in that debate with respect to, I do think that, the modern society has advanced women with respect to legally and economically more so than any other time in human history here. If you view like profit and consumer goods and access to sort of things like that as your standard, which again, whether that should be the standard or not, is there some question here. And again, it's worth pointing out that like in the sort of actual communist countries, they're quote unquote further behind. I will say that is sort of funny side effect here. In places like Romania, I should be careful, Poland, Ukraine, and Russia. Now, of course, the Graebers and others would point out that they were sort of further, but they're just more closer to serfdom than the United States and Britain and Germany are. And they are correct that they are more closer to serfdom. But there was never a woman premier or party leader of either China or Russia or whatever, USSR. So is Deidre McCloskey right to support? Are modern day feminists the biggest defenders of current existing? Again, this is not pure capitalism. This is one of the irritations I have with people like David Graeber. David Graeber was saying that Obamacare marketplace is actually an example. This is sort of like a corporate subsidy given to healthcare to provide access to lower this is not free market capitalism, the Hoppian Friedman tradition, at all. This is like the opposite of it. It's highly regulated, it's subsidies. But the current existing, what they call capitalism, or maybe neoliberalism, are they the biggest defenders now and beneficiaries? Now, this is where beneficiary is sort of interesting word here, because in a way, if you look at happiness surveys, are they really quote unquote happy? Because a lot of them seem unhappy, so maybe they're not beneficiaries, but are they at least in a way the sort of biggest supporters? Because again, as I pointed out in the other episode with Natty, certain governments in Northern Europe are full of women. They're like 75-80% women in like their parliament makeup. Some of them will fluctuate, of course, but are they sort of the currently Swithin? What do you make of that?
I think that it's certainly the case that if you look at sort of the mainstream sort of influential feminist movement, they are no longer overtly Marxist in any way. They're really sort of welfare state capitalists. And this is sort of, in general, sort of a move away from sort of traditional economically based Marxism to sort of like identity politics, sort of oppression Olympics type stuff, which starts really sort of in the 1980s. And I think that's partially because women kind of realize that, well, the feminists do, that actually this sort of welfare state capitalist system is a really good system for them for two reasons. One, well, they've got the corporation that they can sort of they can climb up in and, you know, go girl power. And then they can also go, well, you know, we still don't need men. Why? Because we've got the welfare state. So if things go bad, well, you know, we can get bailed out by the other daddy. And so you effectively have this weird sort of polyandric position in sort of welfare state capitalism, that women can be married to the state and the corporation, which is a way of sort of maintaining their sort of social position and sort of advancing sort of quote unquote their interests. But as one feminist pointed out, she's more of like an individualist feminist. If you look at women in the workplace, most women just do part-time jobs, and they clearly have very little career interest at all. And if you look at the standard deviation of incomes between women, it's massive, much more than men. Oh, well, no, that might not be true. If you look at the median, I think. No, what I'm going to say is this. It's hard to say. Quantifying is difficult because there's some men at astonishing amounts. So the standard deviation is really big. But if you look at like a curve, there's loads of women who don't earn very much, and then there's very few who earn a lot more, whereas there's much more of an obvious sort of bell curve with men. Not many earn very little. Most of them are kind of in the middle. So distribution is different. Because there aren't that many women who actually care that much to sort of like climb. Now, there are more than there used to be. Now, whether or not they're better off or not is another question. I do think it's funny in sort of a bleak sense. They're always going about, oh no, if you look at girls' mental health in schools, it's always going down over time. You look at the self-report studies, you know, they feel their self-reported happiness is down. And I'm like, oh no, this must be because of sexism and stuff. It's like, I'm pretty sure by your standards, 1950s and 60s was way more sexist than it is now, but somehow they were happier. I'm not sure that reducing sexism is the solution.
And what's further funny is like 3/4 to like 9/10 of the like significant number of primary and middle school teachers are women. Like that's a further funny statement. So like, where are they getting this from? It's keep going. Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's yeah, I mean, in schools, it's all sort of a female environment, pretty much. Only when you sort of like get to secondary school, but even there, it's mostly sort of to a large extent female, especially in English and the humanities. So, you know, oh no, it's patriarchy. It's like, I'm pretty sure it's not been doing very much. So it's, yeah, I think, yes, the current situation allows them to earn more money than they otherwise would, but whether it really makes women happy is another question.
Sorry to interrupt again, but so to ask the question, is Deidre McCloskey right? If you were to take the position which you're not going to, but if you were to hypothetically take the position, how would you take the Deidre McCloskey side of the debate? And why?
Clearly. I mean, if I was like, girl power, going to get to the top. I mean, corporations provided brilliant source of this, and the advancement of technology, quote unquote, sort of state capitalism has produced allows sort of female advancement. I'd also say, although McCloskey might not like me making this argument, but corporations are perfect for women because, on average, they are significantly less, they're significantly more risk averse. So actually getting that many female entrepreneurs, as in they start from the ground up and actually an entrepreneur, is going to be a lot fewer than men. And so they're unlikely to be founders and running companies that they have founded. But they're much more likely to climb up a company that already exists. Because, it already exists as a corporate hierarchy. We can climb it, follow the rules, we can be conscientious, we can get there. Plays to female strengths. So now McCloskey might not like the argument, but I do think that's why a corporation is really good if you wanted a sort of female advancement in the workplace. Because if you have smaller firms and there's more of them, there's less sort of climb, and how to get to the top really is to run one. Because you could run one that's been founded by somebody else, but you're not going to get, if you had a society where you had relatively small firms which were mostly own and run, started by the founder, well, obviously the founder is a starter, then you get fewer women in higher places.
Quick interruption here again. Small family firms tend to actually look ironically like families. Like if you look at small restaurants run by families, like they look like families, which again goes back to the sort of, the premise number one, which, we'll say, well, that's just an extension of the patriarchy. The husband owns the restaurant. He might employ his children from time to time. The wife does certain aspects. Many small businesses, contracting businesses, restaurants, they sort of have this basic makeup here where certain groups will assist, and so forth. But then again, the large firms, of course, which the left is very critical of, except Ben Burgess. Ben Burgess is honest. Ben Burgess wrote Matt Brunig. Matt Brunig wrote an article for Jackman in defense of mega corporations. It wasn't entitled that, but it's more or less that's the actual should be the title here. But small businesses, especially the honest ones, so to speak, like your piano tuners and your plumbers, you might have certain aspects of people doing assistance roles, but it looks again, it's sort of like how the Hutterite communities look. They look more quote unquote reactionary there. So I thought I'd add that interruption there. Sorry for interrupting.
No. With corporations as well, another reason why female advancement is small firms are more personal and so take sort of individual differences more seriously. Whereas corporations, what they like is they're big organizations and they're trying to control many, many sort of human resources, not people, but human resources. And the way they set up Tracy treats everybody as fungible. And so everyone's kind of this interchangeable unit in this greater whole. And so in a sense, you would expect them to be the most egalitarian, or at least treat people that way, because you kind of need to sort of like move them around and sort of, you're just an individual, you're a number, you are just a human resource, and we can manipulate you in the sort of the best way possible for the corporation. Whereas if it's more personalized on an individual basis, you probably get more be treated differently by sort of the smaller firm, because you don't have this ridiculous, we must follow procedure type thing, because you can just do what makes sense. So yeah, corporations, or in general, larger organizations in general are going to basically depersonalized. In a sense, they're going to degenderize. And I think large government bureaucracies would do the same to a large extent. So I do think it's possible to have sort of more welfare and less capitalism and be able to do this. I mean, in principle, I can see the Marxist feminists having sort of like this utopia of them being able to climb the Politburo. I think that's possible. But given the state on the ground, well, it is sort of like state capitalism which has provided the advancement of women on their terms. I think that's undeniably true.
I will add one more final comment and question for you. This also explains one of the tensions one of our sort of niche issues is disputes within libertarianism here. And one of the disputes between libertarianism, of course, between the sort of like Kevin Carson, Nick Gillespie, I'll throw in there too, sometimes Yaron Brooks and Jeffrey Tucker too, and sort of course like the Rothbard Hoppe, I don't know, right coalition here, and there's some centrists too, is the issue of women, feminism, and so forth, where the sort of right ones, they're either indifferent or not, if not supportive of certain disparities. And of course, the sort of more liberal or left-minded ones are less supportive here. Now, I do think Nick Gillespie I think Nick Gillespie actually interviewed Deidre McCloskey. I could be wrong about that. I could be misremembering that. Don't quote me on that. But it is interesting that like the reason types, they will very much go along with and they'll go after like the pay gap myth, saying like if capitalist employers, and it's a correct argument, if capitalist employers are so greedy, why don't they hire women if the pay gap is true? It's not really true as it suggests. Now, there are some feminists who make these sort of more abstract criticisms and say, well, these things should be valued more. But then that goes back to our comment two things where it's like, why is working for a gambling firm more valuable? I mean, this is where it's like, why do you want to be in that organization here? And then David Graeber, then you should have posed a problem with the Chomsky-Graeber problem, where they have a sort of fundamental disagreement, which they're not too public about it. They sort of hide this. Here because they know it's a contentious topic here. But I do think it's one of the issues that's within libertarianism that sort of falls apart. That sort of has disputes here. I think one of the reasons I want to do this discussion was to sort of highlight, where the two camps are and where the two camps might be. I enjoyed doing this discussion here. I think you would agree with that. It is a sort of point of contention between like the Carsons and Gillespies versus the PFS type people. Would you agree? And thanks for doing it. I don't really have any more final comments with it. I enjoyed doing this.
They would no. I think that the recent times are reasonably interesting on the pay gap. The best example of this, I can't remember who did the video, but Steve Horwitz, recently deceased, did a video on the pay gap, and he said that basically the pay gap was a myth. But he said, but the underlying argument, which I think kind of the reason I to buy into, Horwitz was saying that, the reason why women earn less is because they do like humanities degrees, which for whatever reason pay less. Probably because people care about like cool stuff that like makes their life better, which is kind of STEM related fields. We need someone to fix the boiler. We don't need someone to write me a novel. I mean, novels are kind of nice, but I kind of prefer that the boiler works. So he didn't go into that, but I suspect that's one of the reasons why you have the difference in wages. And he was saying, well, it was a cultural issue. So they might then say, yeah, the pay gap is a myth as it's presented, but it's still kind of a problem because there's some sort of like latent patriarchy which needs to be purged, and we need to sort of like advance equalitarianism so that men and women have the same sort of interests.
But sorry to interrupt again, but you do agree that within that, like that Tucker, Gillespie, and Carson none of them would identify as anti-feminists. Correct?
Oh no. Certainly wouldn't. They wouldn't. But what I'm saying is they can be pretty good on the technical aspects of the pay gap. But then they'll go, we need a more deep-rooted problem, and they may go say, oh no, there's this underlying social issue that needs to be dealt with. And it's kind of stuff like the marketplace isn't to blame. It's kind of culture and it's like deep-seated things that are there. But yeah, certainly they probably identify as feminists. And I mean, sort of Carson, for instance, would think that. Along with sort of greater levels of income equality under the freedom market, you'd also get greater levels of egalitarianism, et cetera, between men and women. I mean, almost certainly he would say that. And it is a bone of contention. But again, I think the real bone of contention there is really the vision of the ideal society. The ideal society amongst sort of like how should we say, the more leftist of the libertarians, although you may not necessarily consider themselves left libertarians as such, would be kind of cosmopolitan, sort of deracinated individuals. Oh, that's kind of unfair, say deracinated. But people of the world, they're not constrained by their upbringing. They can self-actualize themselves as individuals, as being individuals. And so, we should, whilst bizarrely implying that sort of traditional feminine stuff is kind of bad and more masculine stuff is good, but that's kind of part of the vision. Should be all out, getting money and earning and that kind of thing. Whereas the right libertarians are kind of more sympathetic to the idea that the sexual division of labor kind of makes sense and is kind of good as part of an ordered society. So really, that's where all the disputes lies. If you were to create an ideal society, which still had crime, we're not going to go super utopia, obviously no crime. Well, actually, even if you said no crime, what would it look like? What would people do? Although I suppose you could then go, no one died. Well, I suppose you could avoid. Then it gets a little bit even more difficult. So I think that's the real sort of difference between them. But it's been an interesting topic. And now I'd just like to thank everyone listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family and subscribe to us on Podbean on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And if you want to contact the show for any reason, please contact us at mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com.